everyone. Welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Dean Mitchell. Sit back, relax, but pay attention. You're about to enter the smartest doctor in the room. I am sure all of my listeners know a doctor among their friends or family. Typically, someone who is smart, overall pragmatic, conservative type, not exactly the wild life of the party type. Present company included. I definitely fit into that category. However, today's guest is a doctor who's more like a cross between James Bond and a superhero in a white coat. He is unconventional in every sense of the word. But before I bring him on, I do have to share a story how I found out about him over 40 years ago. It was in the fall of 1981, and I was a senior at Brown University, and I was applying to medical schools. And the anxiety of waiting to get my interviews and eventually be accepted was enormous. And it actually made me think really carefully whether or not I was really cut out to be in the field. But I'll never forget, it was like on a Friday in the fall, I went to my school mailbox where my favorite magazine came rolled up in my little box, and it was Sports Illustrated. And yes, since I was a kid, I loved Sports Illustrated with its amazing pictures, and articles were pretty good too. And my personal dream was to be in Sports Illustrated. But this particular issue had a really interesting story, not about a basketball or football player, but about a doctor. And his name was Bob Arnott. And the article depicted a swashbuckling guy wearing a white coat. In fact, I actually have the magazine. I was able to dig it out. So it was with a little help from my son, who's really good at finding things. And the article was titled, "What's Up, Doc?" And the journalist from SI followed Dr. Arnott around as he went on his own plane from emergency room to emergency room, doing all his sporting things, skiing, sail surfing, roller skating. It was just incredible. As I said earlier, I'm more the cerebral type, like if you think Dr. House, but Dr. Arnott made being a doctor seem like beyond exciting. Over the years, I've seen Dr. Arnott's name come up in popular health journals where he's penned columns, and he's also found time to write books. I think I have like 15 of them have been on the bestseller list. However, he still continued to be a daredevil. And when I again heard about him, he was a journalist for NBC and CBS covering the war in Iraq. And then he did a series called Dr. Danger. So as you see, it's like an amazing, mind-boggling amount of things for one person. So it's really my excitement and pleasure to welcome someone I've admired from afar for a long time, Dr. Bob Arnott.
Very kind of you. Thank you. Thanks for dragging the magazine out.
Yeah, this was really cool. I'll never forget when I got this. And then my son, who knows how to get anything with memorabilia, he's kind of an expert in that. I said to him, Zach, I said, I need this article again. I never forgot about it. I said, and I started to look through Google, and I saw it was in October, which was again the fall when I remember getting it. And I don't want you to get too upset because this is again 40 years ago, but there is a picture of a young doctor with a lot of floppy hair, but he's still got a lot of hair, so you're lucky. Anyway, all right, let's get into some of the interesting things. I think, again, hopefully our listeners will enjoy this. So as I mentioned, growing up, Sports Illustrated was my favorite magazine. Later on, okay, I like New England Journal of Medicine and Scientific American, But back in the day, it was SI. And in fact, Sports Illustrated, which unfortunately its demise, I think the print edition is no longer even available anymore. They used to have a little section called Faces in the Crowd, where up and coming athletes were featured. And I was a high ranked tennis player back in the day in high school, and I played a little bit in college. So I was hoping one day to get into the magazine. So I have to ask you, Dr. Arnott, how did SI find you to write an article about? Do you remember?
It's so funny. I was having this conversation last night about Terry McAuliffe. I don't remember him, but he was the governor of Virginia. And he went out with my sister in college. And he had a 5-year plan by the week, every 5 years. I never had any plan at all. I never planned to be on television, planned to be in Sports Illustrated. It all just happened through great good fortune. I had been at a cocktail party in New York with a girlfriend of mine. I ran into a guy named Ed Hegarty. And Ed ran U.S. rugby. And I was talking, he says, that's a really interesting story. I got a writer friend at Sports Illustrated. And I go, okay. And then the guy called me up and it all kind of happened. But I never had any plan going forward. I just roll with the punches. Just always, I should say that I had a great sort of affinity for the 19th century British explorers, looking for the source of the Nile as an example, and looking for the Great Lakes in Africa. And
so you were like an Indiana Jones. I missed it. You were not a superhero. You were more like the Indiana Jones doctor.
Well,
that's what it's going to sound like.
So in any case, there was Richard Burton, his wife Isabel, wrote this wonderful book called A Rage to Live. And as you know, in medicine, there's a very sort of circumscribed, very sort of slow path. And I remember being at Queen Square Hospital on elective in London. And there was this poor 51-year-old resident who was waiting for a position. He waited 30 years for a position. And so I said, I'm going to follow Richard and Isabella Burton, A Rage to Live, and just really go out. In fact, I had read that they spoke 51 different languages and dialects and said, I'm going to pick a language up every year just like them until I catch up. I didn't quite catch up, but it was just, it was kind of a rage to live. I mean, it was just like,
That's what it sounded like. When I read the story, it really did. It seems like you were just in a hurry to live. I mean, I tell anybody to read this article because it's really it was October. You can probably get it in the library, October 19th, 1981. I mean, it's just like you bounce from one thing to the next. I was getting dizzy just reading the story again. But let me ask you this, too. This is interesting because in the article at the time, you were an emergency room physician, which was kind of interesting because it made sense. Like, I didn't see you as the kind of doctor who could just go to the same office every day. But what was interesting, just for our listeners, you were manning ERs at the time, but like flying from one hospital to the next in different states. So what made you interested in ER medicine? Did you just like kind of the gore, the trauma, the excitement, or the flexibility? What was it that drew you to that in the beginning?
So when I was doing my residency, I would moonlight. I didn't know about emergency medicine. In fact, I should tell you, my very first day in the emergency room was an intern. Very first patient I'm standing there was a cardiologist named Doug James, and they wheeled this patient in. And the very, very first thing he said to him was, "Have you seen a priest?" I go, "What? What did you say? I mean, where's the bedside manner? Where's the easy approach?" So this guy had a dissecting aneurysm, and he was dead 4 hours later. They tried their best. So that was my introduction to the ER. But no, I loved it because it gave you, so much variety. It was so interesting. And, when you make diagnoses in medicine, it's not like A, B, C, D, E, F, G. It's like A, G, P, T. It's this pattern. You go, boom, this is what I think it is. And I remember one case, this guy came in the emergency room complaining of chest pain. And the very first thing I did is I reached for his left ankle where there was no pulse. And I said, "Get the cardiac surgery team in." Before an EKG or history or anything, I just said, "This guy's got a dissecting aneurysm. Let's get the team in." And this one we actually happened to save. So, no, I loved it. And what had happened is that I had just wanted to do a little moonlighting while I was running this lab in Lake Placid. I had a lot of friends who were Olympic athletes, and they desperately wanted to have the same kind of elite level of sports science and sports medicine as they had in Europe. Sports medicine in the U.S. had been orthopedics, and sports science in Europe had been exercise physiology and biomechanics. Right. So I set up a deal with Massachusetts General Hospital and their pulmonary lab to sort of do exercise physiology, and mechanical engineering at MIT is kind of a basis for this sports science lab in Lake Placid. And I
remember they mentioned in the article. That's right. Mm-hmm.
So I went all over the key European labs, but there was no money in this. There was nobody supporting this, so I had to support myself. And I got a job just doing little ER medicine. And then the head of the company goes, "You're the chief medical director." I go, "Okay." So I had a little airplane, and I think we had 137 different emergency rooms. So I would go and I'd pitch the emergency room, and then I handpick the crew, and I worked there for the first month, and it was all over the country, and I had this little single engine airplane that I would sort of putt from one to the next, trying to sort of keep my lab in sports science alive, keep that dream alive while I was trying to actually pay for the lab by doing emergency medicine. So it was,
yeah, you mentioned that in the article. Like, I think that it cost you like $100,000 at the time or something. But it's interesting about emergency medicine. Because I did it during my internal medicine training, and it is true. It's probably one of the most exciting things, as a doctor you can do. A person comes in, obviously if they come into emergency room, in many cases, it's like the worst episode of their life, or otherwise they wouldn't be coming to the emergency room. You're doing dramatic things. A lot of times you can see them get better, or unfortunately really get super sick. Either way, it's just very dramatic. It's like, I think it's why I love the TV show ER. I think Michael Crichton and his whole gang, they did a really good job. I think as close as you can get to what it really feels like to be in ER. And also, as you know too, it's weird too. Sometimes there's downtime, when nothing's going on, so you got to keep yourself busy. And then there's other times it's just chaos, where you're having 3 people coming at once with either MIs, a broken ankle or something, and you're it. You have to to manage it. So I'm sure, like a lot of the things in your life, it's all about a little bit of an adrenaline rush.
But it's interesting because my kids have this motto for me. They say, that my main motto in life is thrive in chaos. And I was with this doctor from Yale who'd been a producer of mine named Lisa Sanders. She wrote the TV show.
Oh, Lisa, she was on my show. Yeah, she was she was the writer for House, right?
Well, but the interesting thing about Lisa Sanders is so Lisa and I are down in North Carolina, and she is my 39-year-old producer at CBS News. And we're coming down through these boiling rapids. We get halfway down through the rapids, live shot on morning television, and I looked out, and there's this woman face down, dark blue, and dead in the water, right? So I reach over, I pull her in, we start towards the shore, start banging on her chest. We do CPR on live television, and lo and behold, she comes back to life. And Lisa Sanders goes, "That's the most amazing thing I've ever seen. I'm going to medical school."
I know. I remember talking to her about that. That was the thing that really spurred her to go on to medical school, because she was older at the time. I mean, it wasn't, she wasn't like right out of school. She had been like a journalist, like you said. Wow, yeah, that's pretty. Awesome.
Every female friend, I actually have 2 interns every trimester at Dartmouth for this global health organization I helped run.
Yeah, we can get into that.
Mm-hmm. And I always say, you can do it all. You just can't do it all at the same time. And so Lisa then goes in her 40s, goes to medical school. I think has 3 kids, becomes chief resident, writes the show House, is a correspondent for New York Times. So I reunited with her a couple of weeks ago. We're on the phone, and she goes, I never saw you more comfortable than in the middle of a war zone. That is, the more chaos there was, the calmer you were. And I think that's probably true of emergency medicine. The more that happened, the sort of calmer that I was. And what's interesting is that there are a couple of things I missed along the way. That is, at Mass General, which was my kind of hero hospital, they despised emergency medicine. They didn't think it was a real specialty. Well, because
you're not special
surgeons,
Oh, right. There's a lot of turf war. Yeah.
So I didn't think it was ever going to be anything. And now my co-CEO of this Health Tech Without Borders that we run, he's the vice chair of acute care at Mass General, and the new president, Massachusetts General Hospital, that is the main Harvard teaching hospital, is an ER doc. So it has come full circle.
No, you're 100% right. When we trained, ER, there wasn't
the bottom of the pile.
Right. Well, it wasn't even a training program. They, like you said, internists and surgeons kind of co-manned in some cases, but a lot of times it could just be an internist, manage the ER, and it's really a very different kind of medical care. And I'm glad that they do have like emergency medicine training programs now, because it's a different animal that you're dealing with. And it wasn't until years later.
It's interesting what you were saying, though, because you about emergency medicine and having downtime. So it turned out that everybody else was incredibly busy. Like you were a cardiologist, you were up like 24 hours a day. So the emergency medicine specialists, because they had blocks of time on and off, they could administer. And so they were the ones who moved up the food chain in these big hospitals to run them because they had the extra clear-cut time to be able to learn how to administrate a hospital. So I learned that. I could have stuck with emergency medicine, been chief someplace, but I didn't.
Yeah, and some people too, as you know, also, which kind of like fit into your type of lifestyle too, like the idea, again, in my practice, I mean, I do like a specialty practice in immunology, and I see a lot of chronic cases, so patients, constantly following up with me. But, with the ER kind of practice, which is interesting, it's like, when you are done, you're finished. You can go home, you're not normally seeing follow-up patients in the ER. So it gives, I think, a lot of flexibility. I think a lot of even young doctors, some of them prefer that. They like that they'll go in, they'll do 4 shifts a week, hard shifts for 12 hours. But after that, they're off the clock, and they don't want that responsibility of having to follow up with patients, which is okay. There's just different styles of practice. And I think, ER medicine gives a lot of, young doctors who are interested in that, a lot of the excitement and and the flexibility. They don't have to worry about running an office practice, which has its own, pros and cons. Let me ask you about
I actually thought of doing immunology, rheumatology, and I was all set to go off and do a residency in that, and then sports science, sports medicine took off, and then broadcasting. Again, it was
okay. I'm sorry. Yeah, so I wanted to ask you about too, because you really were ahead of your time. It's so interesting how it's mentioned. Like I look back now, 40 years later, how it was mentioned in the article you were setting up that lab in Lake Placid, and again with your amazing, busy skiing and roller skating and surfing and everything. You're such an athlete, and like you said, the domain used to be really orthopedics. They fixed the broken bones, this and that too. But in Europe, they were way ahead of us, saying, you know what? Cardiovascular training, flexibility. I mean, this is what makes elite athletes elite and keeps them there. So did you ever veer off from that, or you've always kept your hand in that a little bit too? Because it did seem like that when I read the article. If I would have pictured you back then, I said, what's Dr. Arnott going to be doing 20, 30 years later? I'd say he'd be head of the sports physiology lab and the Olympic doctor, that kind of thing.
Well, I did that. I was an Olympic physician. I was a U.S. ski team physician. Okay. I was on the board of the U.S. ski team for many years. I have an 11-year-old who actually is a ski racer. I race internationally and go to the world championships for ski mountaineering racing, where you run up these hills at 1,000,000 miles an hour, little skins on these tiny little, almost cross-country-like skis, and you rip them off and you're coming down at 65 miles an hour. My motto for the sport is ascend like a mountain lion, descend like a small whimpering child. I do that. I do the world championships for stand-up paddling. But it's very interesting. I was with an unnamed friend of mine who does incredibly well. I mean, makes hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars a year. And we're roughly the same age. And I looked at him, and it's like, he's kind of getting old, And it's like, would I really trade that for what I've got? I mean, I'm looking out of this spectacular scenery here in Vermont. And so I believe from my very earliest days in exercise physiology, and from that first book I wrote, Turning Back the Clock, that you really could take yourself back in time. And so now I use one of these Whoop devices. And as you know, the only true marker of physiologic age that you can see and change on a regular basis is this thing we call HRV. And I've been able to take mine from that of someone in their 70s to someone in their late teens. And I go out and I compete regularly with kids in their 20s. I don't beat them all, but I beat a lot of them. And I think that the biggest single secret to life is really staying young and vigorous. And what I find interesting is all the people I know that, are really smart and are like running hedge funds, or they're, a tip-top analyst at Bain or McKinsey or something, is they kind of thumb their nose at having any kind of specialized knowledge of exercise physiology. It's like, they dumb it down like, I'll go and walk a couple of miles, or I'll get on a treadmill or something. And so they lose the whole game. Yeah. That is, they could sit down, they could give you the smartest possible take on the Middle East or, some stock or some macro economics, but they're Luddites when it comes to exercise physiology. And I think that that's going to lead to an early demise for many of them.
Yeah, I think you're right. But I do have to ask you this too, because again, over the years, as I said, I have followed you in some of your columns that you've written for like Men's Journal. And, you're a little bit like Evel Knievel. I think you've broken like pretty much every bone in your body. And I remember I read this because this was wild. I think you mentioned that, because I think if you don't mind me mentioning it, you had hip replacement, but I think you had double hip replacement the same day, same operation. I've never heard of that. I mean, because usually surgeons will not do that. They're like, no, we can't do, like whatever it is, both at the same time, because how are you going to move?
Well, I go to the surgeon. I go, you know what? If I had just one done, I won't go, oh, that was great. It only hurts half as much. I mean, if you had both done, you wouldn't have any way of comparing it. But I do remember walking down Fifth Avenue on crutches and having people just whiz by me. They just knocked my crutches out from under me. So it was hard. But I mean, I made the mistake of waiting too long. I waited through my 50s and sort of gave them up. And so since then, I've vowed to do at least 90 minutes of exercise every single day to sort of make up for it. But it's the most perfect operation. I mean, a lot of people...
They're really good at it these days. You're right. I see so many people who you see limping around, and all of a sudden, hopefully if it goes well, they get their life back,
But I had this thing called a BHR, Birmingham hip resurfacing. So what they do, instead of lopping off your whole femur, what they do is they put a new head on the femur. Mm-hmm. And it's been the most perfect biomechanical operation you can imagine. My hips are better than the original equipment. And a lot of my friends, of course, accused me of having gotten my hips resurfaced really to improve my performance rather than treat my arthritis, which is partly true.
Oh, actually, if you don't mind sharing this, what would be a typical, program for you exercising? Is there a certain amount of weightlifting or, cardio? I mean, obviously you get joy in doing, obviously, the actual sports, but do you have like a regimen, or you just take it as, it's sort of not really, scheduled?
So I had a coach named Hunter Allen. He was a tip-top Tour de France level bicycle coach. And when I hit 65, I said, give me the bad news. What do you mean the bad news? Okay, well, I'm 65. Tell me, what's going to start to happen? How am I going to start to fall apart? How am I going to start to age? He says, Bob, in a professional level training program, you will continue to improve until you're 85. And at 76, I'm better and faster at everything than I was at 65. Wow. And so the real trick here is that you want to have professional level coaching and a professional level training program, which I do. So I train for each season a sport that I compete against the very, very best in the world at world championships. Wow. And with that, and I use this Whoop device. I use the Garmin's. I have all this stuff on my wrist all the time. And what it allows me to do is, the biggest mistake when you get older and older than 30 is you tend to do the same thing every single day.
Right.
And the fact is that you need to slow down and recover enough on recovery days. You can go super, super hard on your hard days. So I use this device called Whoop, W-H-O-O-P, and it shows me, every single day am I recovered, how's my sleep, what's my strain like. And then with that, I'm able to progress so that I get better and better every year at what I do. And so I would just tell people to keep that in mind, that, you may mock exercise, and, I see these people think they've beaten aging when they're 50s, and a little bit of a pot belly, and they're so proud of themselves they've beaten aging, which they haven't. I think you want to be, lean and fit and to basically be a professional athlete.
Well, I could see, I mean, obviously it was in the article, but I could see just talking to you get excited about this stuff. It's a little bit like with tennis. I actually had 2 major ankle surgeries, and in my 40s, and my career really was finished. I was just too afraid to play. I mean, it was such major surgeries. I was out for 3 months each one. I didn't do them at the same time. I asked the surgeon about that. He said, absolutely not. He goes, we've never done that on anybody. It was a very tough recovery. But now I sort of got a second life. I found a really good trainer who stretches me out and has me do all these exercises. I'm playing like when I was in my 30s. And I'm 63, but like you, I just get so excited about it. So now even when I do my own training, whether it's weights or other things, I'm thinking like you in the sense, like, how do I get better? When I'm playing, I usually like to play against pros. Like I'll do, like a local pro. I'll hit for a while and then I'll play points, and they play me hard. It's like they turn it off that I'm a 63-year-old doctor. They're like, no, you're not getting a point off me. And it's just so exciting. So I think that's the thing that, again, for our listeners and patients, find things that you love and then work it out with weights and doing whatever is riding a bike. It doesn't have to be drudgery. It's be like, hey, this is part of the deal to make you respiratory, physiologically strong. Would you agree?
And I do the same thing with tennis. I don't really play tennis, but I have a very, very, very good coach, and I just get out there and I just have him hit the baseline. I have the big sort of super wild Western grip, and I just okay. Go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. But I agree. I mean, I'm a huge believer in game improvement technology, that whatever the sport it is, get the best sneakers, get the best racket, the most high tech. And the other piece of it is motor learning. A lot of people know the biomechanics, the weight training, the exercise physiology, but they don't realize how important motor learning theory is, that you really can learn any sport. But it's like a language. When you first start to speak French, you go, je veux que, little tiny pieces, and it takes your whole brain. And then you go, je veux tapis. You crunch it down so there's this tiny piece of the brain. And so we're creating these motor programs in sport. And so I'm very proud of what you've done in tennis. That's great. To be able to play at that level at your age is wonderful, because it means you've been able to create this motor program, which is such a big and important and highly ignored part of exercise science.
Yeah. I want to ask you about, because, again, you're always doing unbelievable things, and I wanted to get into your war stuff, but I actually just don't want to make sure we run out of time. The global outreach doctors program that you're doing, I read something to the effect of like you've been helping out in Ukraine. Can you tell us about the organization a little bit, like what you're doing?
Sure. So what happened is that during COVID, I called up the president of Mass General, which again was Harvard's key teaching hospital. I said, listen, you're going to learn the most amazing things about COVID, and I think that we ought to have a way of getting this out to the world. So they did a thing called the COVID Urgent Response Task Force, or whatever it was. But in any case, we had a whole series of videos. It was such a treat talking to the best doctors in the world there. And one of them was Jerome Lee, who immediately sees this, and we teamed up and we did a whole series of these. And we found, as an example, that in New York City, I think 15,000 people died on ventilators, and it was largely because they had incredibly high PEEPs, or pressures. And at Mass General, we said, no, you started very low pressure. And so roughly 95% of their patients survived. When they were in New York, I think 95% died on the ventilators.
It was a disaster. Yeah, it was one
terrible,
of the big misses. Yeah.
And so in any case, we had these videos out, put them out worldwide, so that people would say, no, this is the way you did it. So we had all these wonderful, really incredible lessons. The most important, which I think also had to do with ventilation, that it wasn't necessarily the masking, unless you're using an N95 mask, it was the ventilation. So in any case, at the end of that, Jerome said, we're starting, Ukraine's gearing up, and we need your help. So I joined as co-CEO of this thing called Health Tech Without Borders. And the dream is this. I've spent, years in different parts of Africa, in the most desperate remote parts. Democratic Republic of the Congo, Rwanda during the genocide, South Sudan during the Civil War, Darfur, you name it. And I was always very torn that you'd be talking to some poor mother out there, and you go, there's this domain level expertise at Harvard and Stanford and the best medical schools. Why isn't this woman getting it, And so the dream here is to take the domain level, top level expertise and using digital technology to deliver it there. So in Ukraine, as an example, we have done 200,000+ telemedicine visits. So we can go to the front line there.
Wow.
And then we have cool technology. I'm the chief innovation officer. And so we have a thing called HoloVision, which we partnered with Microsoft on, where we can watch the hands of a surgeon in Ukraine to direct them through a very complicated neurosurgical procedure, or just teach them to the right kind of physical therapy. In fact, we just had 37 Ukrainian physicians to Boston. We're doing this new generative AI, but generative AI has fallen apart because it uses the general internet, so it tends to hyperbolize and creates all kinds of hallucinations. So we use the National Library of Medicine. And so now using AI, we want to be able to, again, take this information from the ground, from the primary healthcare worker out there in really desperate places, and deliver this very, very high level of care. So it's very, very cool. I love it.
That's fairly exciting. Wow. I mean, it's so important. I mean, there's so much horror is going on around the world. When they showed, it was really interesting. I was on 60 Minutes a few weeks ago. There was a surgeon in one of the main cities, I'm not sure if it was Kyiv in Ukraine, who wouldn't leave because a lot of the doctors have left. I mean, and he was essentially operating in a basement of what was left of a hospital. And, it's really incredible, what a lot of times what doctors do. And you've also done, we need to mention it too. I mean, how did you get into this gig of like being a war correspondent? I mean, like, going back to the Indiana Jones thing, I mean, like all of a sudden, you're in Iraq. What are you doing there?
So, I had always been incredibly passionate about, human rights, refugees, international development. My second year in medical school, I was spent almost a whole year out in Kenya. My fourth year, I was out in Sierra Leone. And so when I got to CBS News, I go, hey, you guys, this is important. We're going to start to cover this stuff. So I was out in Bangladesh for the floods. And then when the Rwandan genocide came out, I said, this is the most important story of our generation. And they go, no, it's not. And so I said, well, I'm taking a vacation. Where are you going? I'm going to hitchhike out on a Belgian military airplane to the Congo. So I went out to what was then Zaire, and they go, oh, this is an important story. We're sending a satellite dish after you. And so I saw that these really important stories in Africa were incredibly expensive, $600,000 to send out all the satellite gear.
Oh, wow.
So I had this dream of being able to parachute out of an airplane by myself with gear and be able to cover these stories. And so it happened, working with NBC News and Apple Computer. I figured out how to shoot all these stories on my own, take them, cut them on one of these Apple MacBook Pros, and then compress it and send it on satellite phone back to New York. And so then I ended up all over Africa, in the Middle East, doing these stories. And then along comes Gulf War I and II. For Gulf War I, CBS said, we need to have a doctor out there because we're going to have all of these people on the ground. Would you go? And I said, well, I'll go, but I want to cover the story too. So I did. And then the second Gulf War came along, and I was embedded with the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force, which was wild because it was a contest. You wanted to be the first correspondent to Baghdad. And so one morning I'm walking along the berm. Everyone would get up and say, well, who's fighting today? And 7th Regimental Combat Team. So we jump in a helicopter, we go out there, and we go into battle. And this morning, this young officer comes along and says, you were great on Don Imus' show this morning. I go, what? How did you hear that? Well, there's a thing called the Pentagon Early Bird, and so he'd heard this. And so I look down, and I see that he's not just like a captain, he's a general. And he goes, Mad Dog Mattis, he loves your stuff. And so what had happened is I'd been out there, and Don Imus goes, well, I understand the Marines are getting shellacked, and it might be better part of a year until they get to Baghdad. If at all, I go, who'd you hear that from? He goes, well, New York Times, BBC, CNN. I go, oh yeah, those guys, they're about 70 miles behind us with the supply guys. And it might be, 6 months until the tennis knitting makes its way into the new embassy. But these Marines, they'll be in Baghdad within the week. So the guy goes, what do you want? Anything you want? I go, I want it would be with the cutting edge of the spear, the chief, the head regimental combat team. And so he goes, fine, you're on. And so the next morning we're outside of Al Qud. There's all this gunfire every which way. And I go to the colonel. I go, Colonel, I know we're not supposed to go live during these broadcasts, but gauged by the amount of incoming fire, I'd say they know we're here. And I'm no military genius, but can we go live? Because knock yourself out. So we go live. The anchor back in New York going, oh my God, what's all that gunfire? And so she goes, sorry, shouldn't you duck? And I go, sure it's Marine Corps term. Let me check with the gunny sergeant. Gunny, should we talk? He goes, nah, it's not a Marine Corps term. You get heavy machine gun fire from the west, the northwest, the north, the northeast, and the east. D-30 medium range artillery fire from the southwest and the southeast. 61 and 82 millimeter mortar fire. Not much of any place to duck, Bob. And so then there's this guy shooting at him. He picks up his M16 rifle, kills this guy at 300 yards. And this young girl comes out with a baby in her arms who he had been keeping captive. So I go, Idris, Katir, it's dangerous, get down. And the Marines didn't want her in because they didn't know she had a suicide vest. So I run out to her, I take her, I put her down to a foxhole, and I go, all right, Bob, now what have you done? You're here with a 14-year-old girl and a baby in the middle of a foxhole between the Fedayeen, the Iraqis, and the Marines. And all of a sudden, the Marine colonel goes, hey, Bob, do you want to bring your guest in for lunch? So I pick the baby up, take the girl by the hand, take my television camera, walk into the Marine line, and then the Fedayeen start shooting at us. The Marines spin up 2 Cobra helicopters, start shooting back at the Fedayeen. I pick up the baby, pick up the television camera, run up towards these 3 M1A tanks that just come on the scene, and I take my television camera and I go to the Marine colonel and I go, Colonel, you've almost been hit. Your Humvees, the front tire's been exploded. There are RPGs every place. There's gunfire every place. What do you have to say? Straightens up his uniform, looks into the camera and goes, it's a great day to be a United States Marine. So the whole thing was just pretty entertaining.
What would you say, Dr. Arnott, that you learned from a lot of these things? Is there any unifying theme? I mean, you've been in so many of these combat areas, almost like a soldier, that is it pointless at times? Do you see the people? I can imagine in Ukraine, these people seem to be fighting for their country and their life. Did you get that sense even in Iraq? It's very confusing to the American public. I have to be honest with you. I remember times when I used to watch this stuff. I'm like, what are they fighting over land? Are they fighting over their religion? What are they fighting about? For people to die, for families to be decimated.
Well, what's interesting? So a couple of points. I think the first one is that it always annoys me that people can be super up to date on all the nuances of NVIDIA and investing in their stock. But then you have what's happening like right now, between Israel and Gaza and Iran and the Iranian and whatnot. And yeah, it's complicated, but take the time to understand it. And instead of just mindlessly demonstrating, find out what's actually going on out there. And so I find, it's incredibly interesting. I was on the board of the UN High Commission for Refugees and was with the High Commissioner in Congo. And I said, so you're a social scientist, and an expert in foreign relations. What do you like about this job? She goes, it's the most interesting thing in the world. We all know all about European history, but to learn about the Hutu and the Tutsi and whatnot. But I think that the big thing is just that I'm a huge believer in these situations can be righted. And a lot of people say, isn't it depressing being out there? I go, no, it's the most exhilarating thing in the world because you see the greatest good that there is. You see organizations like Save the Children and International Medical Corps and World Vision and Catholic Relief Services, all these, or a couple of times I was actually out with the Israeli army who would have these stand-up field hospitals out of nowhere, and you see the amazing good that people do worldwide. So that's inspiring. And I also think that if people really understood this, and they understood that it really takes a winning force. The trouble with so much of Africa and the trouble with so many wars in the Middle East is that there isn't a military strong enough to win. And so take Congo as an example.
You're right, so it's like a stalemate, basically.
Yeah, so you have all these stalemates, and what happens in the stalemates is no soldiers get killed outside of Ukraine, but in so much of Africa, it's just, you'll have millions and millions of women and children like you have in Congo who suffer because of this. So I'm a little Pollyannish, but I'm a huge believer that things can be made right, and that, working with these great relief groups, that there's a way through, and then understanding foreign policy and really advocating for the right solutions. I'm still very hopeful that there'll be a solution for Israel and Gaza. You'll have a lot of our allies there in the Middle East will finally put this together, and there'll be some kind of a joint administration, whatever it is. But I mean, I'm always a believer and optimist that there's going to be some solution.
No, it's important. One other last thing too, I wanted to talk about how music has played a role in your life. I remember even the SI article, you were busy playing your trumpet on the plane while you're going from one ER to the next, and obviously you said you were just in, was it Austria? Involved with music there. What has that meant to you? What's always drawn you to music?
So obviously you do your podcast because you think you can inspire people and do it.
Right.
And so having spent a lifetime in broadcasting and trying to inspire people and seeing how fractious this become, I thought, music is a great way to truly be able to inspire people. And so I had, from 7th grade, always wanted to be a composer and wondered, do I have it in me? And so I'm a huge advocate of online learning. So I took 41 different courses on composition and music theory. Wow. And then I hired a team of 12 people, not full-time, obviously, but, 4 theorists, 4 composing professors. I was just on with my piano professor, Mark Reiser at the New England Conservatory, conducting and even singing. And so I really do, in fact, this behind me, this is the Musikverein in Vienna. So it's just in Vienna, and I recorded my 5th symphony in the same studio as Hans Zimmer has done all his wonderful movie work, like The Lion King, and where you had Herbert von Karajan, the most famous recording director of all time, record there. And so it's the one thing when you're finally finished and you listen to it, you go, oh my God, where did that come from? How did that ever happen? So, and then of course, once you've listened to it for a couple of months, you go, I can do better, and you dig back in. So I get up every morning and I take my 11-year-old down to the bus stop and I compose for probably 4 or 5 hours, and then I do real work all afternoon and night.
I think that's affecting your HRV more than your running and all your exercise, because I think music is soothing. I tell patients of mine, sometimes I see these very complex cases with severe chronic fatigue, whether it's from an infection or autoimmune or some kind of condition. And, I do a lot of functional medicine too within my conventional practice. And I do try to tell them, and I hope they listen when it's coming from a doctor. I'll say to them, look, aside from what are the supplements we're going to tell you to do, or some medications, and of course we want you to exercise and sleep good. I said, but you have to do something that uplifts your spirit. And I don't have your kind of, I wish I did, but I never had that kind of classical musical background, which I think is really special. But I do know that any music that I do listen to, either whether I'm exercising or just feeling the blahs, can be very uplifting. So is that what you find also? Is it the fascination with music? Is it does something that kind of touches your soul? Not to get too.
Oh, there really is. I mean, it really does make you believe in the Almighty, because when you're done composing, you go, I don't know how I got on that piece of paper. I don't know how it happened, but it wasn't me. So, and it's very interesting, because the very first music composition teacher I had in the Conservatory said, all the early composers, Beethoven, Haydn, Mozart, all of them, and for generations before that, they all believed that music came from God. And you know what? There are a bunch of us that still think that's true.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. Yeah, I guess there's something to that. Why in churches and synagogues, music has always been very important. And even in the gospel churches, I mean, it just seems really, some amazing voices have come out of it, and it's very uplifting. So, yeah, interesting. I mean, you're a polyglot. You do so many friggin' things. I thought I had a lot of interest. It pales in comparison. So let me ask you as we finish up, and this is going to be tough. It feels like almost like I'm a reporter for 60 Minutes. What are you hoping is the legacy of your career? Doctor, journalist, sports person, humanitarian? What are you hoping one day, you can look back and say, or your kids will reflect and say, God, my dad was this?
Well, I think you touched on it. I think that, to be perfectly honest, 100 years from now, they can remember any of this? No. They remember
but they remember you.
Maybe. But I think that there are two things. One is, if you wrote really great music, they remember that. But as you point out, the most important legacy are your children. It's your family.
Yes.
What have you left them?
Yeah.
What if you're looking? Because that's all that's going to be remembered in time. That is the greatest. You read back in time, the greatest correspondent or writer of the day or whatever. They all evaporate in the kind of ether of history. But I think you can leave your children behind and music.
Well, I'll tell you one last thing, which maybe you, again, look how you touched my life in some ways, that I do really feel, I tell this when I lecture the medical students, because I still teach like the immunology section. And I tell them right off the bat, I tell them a few things. I say to them, one, I think immunology and genetics is probably two of the most important languages of medicine, especially going into the future. So please pay extra special attention to it. I say to them also that you're probably not going to remember anything I teach you here about immunodeficiencies and everything else, but I think you'll remember, hopefully, the energy and the passion I have for why it's important to think immunologically whenever you see a patient. And I think, like in your case, whether it's through your Sports Illustrated or your articles, your books, and I got obviously people who know you personally, they're never going to forget you, because you know what, people don't forget character. And I think that's what lives on. And I think that's why teachers are special in general, because, again, their students just will always remember how much that teacher wanted them to be the better part of themselves. So anyway, I thank you for that, because as I said, you made medicine look really exciting. Yes, I told you, trust me. I mean, this is 40 years later.
That's wonderful.
I still am going to keep this magazine, and I thank you so much for taking the time out of your quite busy schedule. And maybe one day in New York, we'll grab a lunch or something.
I love that you are on. I'll see you in New York.
All right.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
All right, thank Bob. Well,
All
this is
those
going to
kind
air
words.
next week. This will air probably next Tuesday. We'll go and I'll shoot you an email, let you know.
I love
Okay?
that.
All right.
Thank you so
Good luck
much.
with everything. Thanks for
Thank you,
doing
Dave.
this.
Great to see you.